understand.
Maybe it's better if you speak.
Yeah, I like to argue for a shift in the way we think about logical completeness. So let's start with a quick overview. So the rough idea is something like this. I take it that when we think completeness, oh, by the way, I'm talking about negation completeness, in the sense that you have a set of sentences, maybe a possible world, maybe a theory, that doesn't matter how it's represented. The point is you have a set of sentences, and when we think completeness, what we mean is that for every sentence or every proposition is either true or false in that set of sentences. And what I like to point out here is that this is an absolute notion of completeness. Absolute in the sense that it doesn't depend on how other theories or how other worlds go. It's just a matter of the language itself and that set of sentences you're thinking about. Okay. And what I want to try to argue in this talk is that this might not be a very useful notion. Not that it's defective in any way. I don't think it's incoherent or anything. Just that maybe because of some observations about our world, we won't use this very often. Instead, I like to propose that we can move toward a relative notion of completeness that looks something like this. I'll say more about what this is later. But I also want to argue in the end that shifting from the absolute notion to this may bear on the way we think about paracomplete logics. Okay. So here's the plan for this talk. I want to first lay out a skeptical argument. The argument will have the implication that maybe the absolute notion of completeness, we are not going to use it very often. So in its place, in the next section, I will propose a relative notion that we can move to. And then at the end, we'll think about implications. I hope at least I can talk about paracomplete logics, and then maybe if there's time, we can talk about other implications. Okay, skeptical argument first. So here's the argument, or the background of the argument. Sometimes we reason about information, a set of information that we take to be incomplete. Let S be a set of sentences that we are thinking about. And when we are doing this kind of reasoning, it seems quite natural to think that in contrast to the incomplete set of information, our world is complete. The facts of our world, the set of sentences that represent the facts of our world is logically complete, at least in the ways that S is not. And yet, at the same time, we might also think that otherwise our world is like S, apart from the logical completeness. So let me give a few examples of this. Fiction might be an example, depending on your view of fiction. I take it the common view is you think Sherlock Holmes is incomplete because the fictions don't specify everything. And that is unlike actual detectives or actual people. Sherlock Holmes is incomplete, but actual people are complete. But at the same time, you might think that apart from logical completeness, Sherlock Holmes is very much like an actual detective. Their world would look very similar to our world. In fact, if you could somehow ask John Watson what he thinks about Sherlock Holmes, he might say that Sherlock Holmes is an actual detective to him. Okay. So those are some quite natural things to think. And now here's the skeptical argument. The thought is, we as a reader from our world, I thought we could ask, from John Watson's perspective, does he see that Sherlock Holmes is incomplete? For example, does he ever think to himself, is Sherlock Holmes right-handed? And then he realizes that the answer to that is neither yes nor no. Like, does he ever go through such an experience? Well, one way we could go is we could say, yes, John Watson does see incompleteness in Holmes. This would be to take seriously the idea that incompleteness is a substantive feature of a world. And we might even assume that it's so substantive that it materializes as some observable feature of the world, so that Watson can look around and see that, in fact, his world is incomplete. Okay. But then this means that the fictional world isn't very much like ours. Like metaphysically, it's quite different. Because I take it the preferred view is that our world is complete, at least with respect to the relevant part. Maybe there are some like small logical gaps in some strange places, but at least when we come to talk about people and detectives, we like to think of our world as complete. Okay. So in contrast to the world of Holmes, if we go down this road, we can look around our world and we can see that it's not incomplete, it is complete. Because we don't observe the strange features that Watson would see were he to look around his world. For me, I don't like this. I prefer not to go down this road, because if we accept this, this would mean that, well, for one, the world of Holmes is quite strange with observable logical gaps in it. I, for one, cannot imagine what it's like to observe logical gaps. So I prefer not to try to cash out this option. And I would also like to point out that if we accept this, the strangeness we are thinking about accepting is quite extensive. We're not talking about logical gaps when it comes to vagueness or future contingents, just some small parts like that. We are talking about things like people and tables, and basically anything that the fiction underspecifies will end up being incomplete, which I take it to be quite extensive. Okay, so at least for me, when I engage with the fictions of Sherlock Holmes, I tend to imagine a world where, look, even if it's incomplete, the characters are somehow not too bothered by it. They can just go about their daily activities and things more or less go as they do in our world. Okay, so for some people, example, Charles Crittenden, they take this as a reason to go all the way to the other end and say fictional worlds are actually complete to the same extent as our world is. But for me, I think we don't have to go that far. We don't have to say the fictional world is complete. All we need to do is say that somehow, even though the fictional world is incomplete, John Watson is not too bothered by it. We can choose to say that Watson doesn't perceive any incompleteness in Holmes, even if it's there. And although we as a reader, we can see some properties that Holmes lacks, these gaps will go observed for whatever reason. We don't have to go into why. Okay. For me, I find this road more acceptable, but there is an implication to this. If we think this is possible, then we might also be open to the possibility that there are logical gaps in our world that could go unnoticed for similar reasons. Because if we take seriously the idea that a fictional world like ours can be gappy and those gaps will go unnoticed, then we could also ask, well, how would our world look like if there were logical gaps in it? And I think the answer to that might be that, well, the world would look precisely as it kind of does now. So maybe we can't be too confident in saying that our world is distinguished from the world of Holmes by completeness. Maybe I should say a bit about how radical this skepticism is. I take it that in this part of the world, people are probably quite comfortable with saying that there are logical gaps here and there. So some of you might already believe in actual gaps. So my argument to say that we are open to the possibility of gaps may not sound very interesting to you. But I'd like to point out that if we accept this argument, the kind of we are prepared to accept might potentially be quite extensive. I mean, Holmes as a fictional character is incomplete, and that goes unnoticed by Watson. So people in our world might similarly also be gappy, and we might not notice their incompleteness. So we are talking about incompleteness that affects everyday objects like that. So we can't kind of bracket it off and restrict it to certain areas, the way we might like to do with inconsistency or something. Okay. Yeah, so that was the argument. I used fiction as an example because I thought with fictional characters, it's easier to bring out the intuitive idea of taking the perspective of a world. But I would like to point out that the argument need not be limited to fiction. We could run the argument in some other domains. This is a quote from Kurt Gödel. Kurt Gödel, he was talking about the incompleteness of ZFC. I think he was talking about it with respect to the continuum hypothesis. He made this comment in his 1947 that look, because ZFC is incomplete with respect to CH continuum hypothesis, this means we need to supplement ZFC with new axioms. Because ZFC is, well, according to him, intended to describe some well-defined reality. And that reality, he thinks, is complete with respect to CH. So the fact that ZFC is incomplete means we don't have a full description. We need to beef up ZFC. Well, we can set aside the fact that Gödel is a Platonist and he believes quite a strong form of Platonism. Even if we grant Gödel his Platonism, his argument assumes that the mathematical facts are complete. But I guess if we buy the argument, we just ran with fiction. We could run a similar argument here and say, well, maybe we are not actually that justified in thinking that the target theory of math, whatever ZFC is intended to describe, we are not so justified in saying that it's complete. So if we don't think that's complete, we might have less motivation to supplement ZFC with new axioms, even if we find that it's incomplete, unless we have some other reason. Okay, that was part one. That was my skeptical argument, saying that I wanted to try and argue that we should drop the idea of absolute completeness when it comes to talking about our world in relation to worlds we typically take to be incomplete. Now, the next thing I'd like to do is think about how we can move toward a weaker relative notion of completeness or incompleteness. And the way I like to try to define a relative notion of completeness goes like this. I take it this is maybe quite a natural way of doing it. we can say a set of sentences W1 is complete relative to another one, W2, just in case any sentence determined in W2 is determined in W1. So if you use a notion like this, we can say, well, a lot of the usual things we want to say. We can say our world is complete relative to the world of Sherlock Holmes, saying that now we are safe from the earlier argument because, well, for one, all worlds are complete relative to themselves. So we can explain why John Watson doesn't perceive any incompleteness in Holmes, because from his perspective, his own world is complete. It's only from our reader's perspective that we find it's not. Okay. Of course, I know this is a rather weak notion. It may not be very satisfying to some people because if every world is complete relative to itself, simply saying our world is complete relative to some others may not be a very interesting property. But I like to try to argue in favor of this notion, maybe give a small brief argument by pointing out that we are used to thinking in these terms when it comes to another similar logical property, namely the consistency of mathematical theories. Gödel's theorems have told us that for a significant class of math theories, they can't prove their own consistency. So we know that when we prove, say, assuming ZFC that there's a model of ZFC plus CH, we don't actually prove that ZFC plus CH is consistent. What we prove is that if ZFC is consistent, so is ZFC plus CH. So we are used to thinking about consistency in this way for math theories. And my brief argument for relative completeness is that if we see completeness as a kind of dual for consistency, then maybe it's also okay to think about completeness in relative terms too. Okay, so upshot of this part, or what we've argued so far, when we are reasoning about incomplete sets, we can't justifiably say our world is absolutely complete and the other set is not. But what we are justified in saying, I think, is that our world is complete relative to that set, and that set is incomplete relative to ours. And that's why I think this is the more useful concept, or the more useful notion of completeness, the one we might use more often. And the last thing I like to do is now talk about some implications, maybe beginning with the way we model our reasoning about logical gaps. So of course, if you're reasoning about incomplete sets of information, we're going to use some kind of paracomplete logic. But I think the different options in the literature may differ a bit on how to treat logically complex sentences involving gappy components. And I thought our discussion earlier might guide our choices here by highlighting the various ways that gaps can present themselves. So here's what I mean. Okay, so go back to the fiction example, right? We know that the fictional world of Holmes is incomplete relative to ours because we as a reader, we can think of meaningful sentences or sentences that make sense to us. And those sentences we can see have well-defined truth or falsity conditions at our world. For example, Holmes is right-handed. In our world, we know what it takes for a person to be right-handed, but they are undetermined in the fictional world. So if you ask us, the readers, is Sherlock Holmes right-handed? That question is meaningful to us. We can imagine a variation of the Holmes world where the truth conditions for that world are satisfied. Now, if you ask us about a logically complex sentence involving that component, is it true that Sherlock Holmes is either right-handed or a detective? It seems to me that, I'm basing on intuition here, it seems to me that the answer might be yes, because, well, that disjunction has a classical truth value, even though it has a gappy component, because both parts of the sentence make sense to us. So we can kind of evaluate it and kind of come to a conclusion about its overall truth value. Okay. So let's call this the external perspective on logical gaps. It's the way logical gaps appear from the perspective of more complete worlds in which those gaps are filled. For example, when we as readers reason about incompleteness in the world of Holmes, we take an external perspective, because even in those respects, even for those respects in which the Holmes world is incomplete, it's complete in our world, so it makes sense to us. Okay. From this external perspective, I thought logical gaps present themselves in this way. They are meaningful propositions. They have well-defined truth conditions, just that in that world, the world we are thinking about, the truth conditions happen to be unrepresented, so the sentence is undetermined. Okay. And because logical gaps are meaningful sentences from this perspective, we might see cases where logically complex sentences with gappy components look like they have classical truth values. So maybe the right paracomplete logic for modeling this kind of reasoning, at least from this perspective, might be something like the strong cleaning logic, where you are allowed to have classical overall value when you have a gappy component. Okay, but this is not always the case. So we could also contrast this with the so-called internal perspective on logical gaps, which is the way gaps appear, the way the logical gap of an incomplete world appears from within the world itself. So if you ask John Watson about whether Holmes is right-handed, he will take an internal perspective because he's thinking about the gap from within his own world. Now, if you're thinking in terms of relative instead of absolute completeness, I'm guessing that John Watson should not say the sentence about Sherlock Holmes being right-handed has well-defined truth or falsity conditions. Because if he does say that, that might be admitting that there is a gap in his work. Instead, I'm guessing John Watson will probably say the sentence doesn't make sense to him for whatever reason. I mean, we don't have to speculate about how logical gaps, where they appear. But the idea is that this sentence maybe doesn't make very much sense to John Watson if we were to ask him, is Holmes right-handed? So I thought if we present to John Watson the logically complex sentence, Sherlock Holmes is either right-handed or a detective, is that true or false? It might appear to him, well, maybe it's a syntactically well-formed sentence, but semantically not very sensible. So I thought the logic that kind of fits better with this internal perspective might be an inflections one, something like a weak linear logic, where if you have one meaningless component, the whole sentence, you kind of find it hard to evaluate. Okay, so well, this part I'm a bit more sure about. I thought, this idea of relative completeness distinguishes these two perspectives. Which perspective is right? I thought this might be a direction for future work, but let me just quickly share some ideas, and then hopefully I will have something to say about it in a few months' time. Okay. So which perspective is right? External or internal perspective? I thought it could be affected by a few possible factors. One thing might be the domain of application. My guess is that in some application domains, the internal perspective is maybe more salient, and then in others, the external might impress itself upon us more. Actually, my initial motivation for this entire project is I was trying to formulate a logic for reasoning about computer simulations. So we know that computer simulations tend to be incomplete. They only represent a restricted part of our world. And when I came to formulating that, well, of course, we are using a prior complete logic. And when I came to the part of thinking, well, how should we treat complex sentences with gappy components? Let's say a disjunction between a gap and a well-defined sentence. Then I came to have to make this choice between saying, yes, a classical truth value, depending on what the well-defined component is, or saying that the whole thing is meaningless because it has a meaningless part. And then, well, the conclusion I kind of came to is that, well, it depends on what perspective you think. If you think from the computer's perspective, then the whole thing, well, might be meaningless. But if you think from a programmer's perspective, sitting from the outside, then maybe you want to say it would make sense. That's why I got this idea of the two perspectives. So I thought for computer simulations, at least for that domain, the internal perspective might be more salient. Because, well, if we think about the results of a simulation, we put ourselves in the perspective of a computer to see what output it gives. But maybe in another case, like say reasoning about mathematical theories, for whatever reason, it seems that when we reason about ZFC or some incomplete theory, some theory we know to be incomplete, somehow at the back of our minds, we still have our intuitive theory of math that maybe it's, well, maybe it's not complete, but it's more complete than the theory we are talking about. And it's hard to let go of that theory, even if we are reasoning about the incomplete one. So maybe when it comes to math theories, that domain of application, external perspective is more salient. So that's one thing I thought could affect the way we reason about incomplete sets. Another thing that might be, well, slightly trivial is the relative salient. Could be the natural language sentence that we use to express the logical gaps. Sometimes maybe the way we phrase a sentence in natural language could make one perspective more salient. So for example, Francesco Berto formulated a logic of imagination that is intended to model semantics for sentences of this form. He said, well, he wants to model sentences of the form, it is imagined in an act whose explicit content is A, that B. And in Berto's formulation, logically complex sentences, they kind of treated in line with the external perspective. He thinks that yeah, if a sentence has a gappy component, it could still have a classical overall value. When I was looking at it from his translation, I thought I kind of agreed with that, but I thought you could also rephrase the natural language sentence to make the internal perspective more salient by saying something like this. Maybe you hide the intentional operator a bit more and you say, in an imaginative episode whose explicit content is A, B is the case. When I work with this translation in natural language, I find myself reasoning more naturally in line with the internal perspective. Okay, all of this is just based on my one person's intuition. I thought future work could be to explore how our intuitions are affected by things like domain of application and natural language phrasing. But anyway, the bigger point here is just that, well, one implication of using a relative notion of completeness is we might realize there's this other set of considerations that could bear on the way we formulate paracomplete logics. That's maybe not as obvious if we are using an absolute notion. Okay, to wrap up, so in this talk, I tried to present a skeptical argument, first showing that we can't be sure our world is complete in an absolute sense, but I don't think we should give up the notion of completeness completely. I tried to propose a relative notion of completeness that we can use in its place, that's weaker, but hopefully more useful. And I try to argue that this notion has kind of affects the way we model our reasoning using paracomplete logics. Yeah, okay, thank you. Hope for your suggestions.
Much. All right, guys. Questions, remarks, comments.